We're going to go ahead and get started in our class on Romans. We are in Romans chapter 4. We're going to start with verse 9. Thank you all for staying. I love the book of Romans, and I really love this chapter. This is one of my favorite chapters in the book of Romans and in the entire Bible. I really appreciated last week's study on this, and we're going to get into it today again, starting with Romans chapter 4, verse 9. Let me give you some background on this. The first 11 chapters of the book of Romans. Keep in mind, Romans was not originally called a book. It was a letter that Paul wrote to the Christians who were in Rome. That's why it's called the book of Romans. It's wrote to the Roman Christians residing in the city of Rome. And the first 11 chapters of Romans were dealing with a major problem that was in the first century church, and that was the problem of racism, problem of bigotry between Jew and Gentile. Gentile being defined as anyone who's not a Jew. The Jews were originally under the old law, the Old Testament, the law of Moses. They were set aside by God as his special people, his chosen people. It would be He chose them, their nation, to bring the Messiah into the world. And they knew this. And the problem with them is that they had allowed it to get to their heads. And so we are God's special people. We are God's chosen people. And so we are better than all the rest of you. We are holier than all the rest of you. And the problem on top of that was that at this point in time in history, the Jews were a conquered people. The Gentiles had conquered them. The Romans had conquered them. And they were living under some pretty severe tyranny. Do you remember the part in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus was saying to love your enemies? And you remember when he said, if anyone forces you to walk with them 1 mile, walk with them 2. And that's where we get that very popular phrase, going the extra mile, right? Well, why did Jesus say that? The reason he used that particular example about how to love your enemies, if someone forces you to walk with them 1 mile, walk with them another mile, was because that's what the Romans were forcing the Jews to do. That's one of many things that they were forcing the Jews to do. If you were a Jewish citizen at that time, and you're walking along the street and you're just minding your own business, and here comes a Roman soldier, the Roman soldier had the legal authority to force you to stop what you were doing. And he would give you everything that he was carrying and just pile it on you. And you were forced by him legally to go with him 1 mile, to carry his things 1 mile. That was tyranny. They were living under tyranny. And just like any people that live under tyranny, you get resentment, you get bitterness, you get hatred in your heart towards those who are treating you as a tyrant would. And so the Jews hated the Gentiles. The Gentiles, in turn, they hated the Jews. The Romans who were sent to Judea, to Galilee, Rome is over here in Italy, and that's where everything, all the power was, that's where everything was happening, kind of like Washington, D.C. But if you were sent, if Caesar sent your garrison all the way over here to the other side of the Mediterranean to backwater Judea or Galilee, that's the equivalent, and you probably heard this mentioned in movies, where the commanding officer in the military, if there's a sergeant or a private that has really messed up and dropped the ball in a major way, have you heard the commanding officer say, well, by this time tomorrow, he's going to be stationed at the weather station up in northern Alaska? You know, that's like the worst posting you could get. It's punishment posting. Well, that's how the Romans look at Judea, and they didn't want to be a Judea. They knew that the Jews hated them, that they were uprisings, and they hated the Jews too. How many of you have seen from years ago the Mel Gibson movie about the crucifixion of Jesus, the Passion of the Christ? Any of you all seen that? Do you remember in the scene where Jesus is being scourged by the Roman soldiers? And do you remember, did it shock you not only the brutality of it, all the blood and the terrible wounds that Jesus received, but did it shock you how Gibson had the Roman soldiers, while they're whipping him, they're laughing at him? And it's all a big game to them. It's all a big sport to them. That's historically accurate because the Romans hated the Jews. And so they see, in Jesus' case, they see an opportunity to take out their frustrations on a Jew by having the legal authority to whip him half to death. They're going to love it. They're going to love it, yes.
Well, conversely, the Jews, we read about zealots.
Yes.
And, the zealots were not only, politically opposed to Roman rule, they were violently opposed to Roman rule. So soldiers were being, kind of like what we read happens to our soldiers in places like Afghanistan. They didn't have improvised explosive devices, but they had hidden knives and they had booby traps of all kinds of poison, and they would do this to the Romans any chance they got. They'd set
Exactly.
them on fire while they slept, and so there was a reason for the Romans to hate the Jews like they did.
Exactly. Very, very good point. In fact, Barabbas, who Pilate let go instead of Jesus. Some gospel accounts, I forget which one, I forget whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, some call him a murderer, but then there's others that say he was an insurrectionist, which means he was a zealot. Then they had arrested him because the Romans looked at him as a terrorist, pretty much.
Hero to the people, so people are surprised when Barabbas, people acclaim him, release Barabbas. Well, he was kind of a hero.
Yeah, exactly. So there is a lot of animosity. And so you have the Jews for the first 10 years of Christianity. The gospel was preached first to the Jews and then to the Samaritans, which were basically half Jews, as it were. But it was still focused on the Jews for the first 10 years. So the Jews who were converted to Christianity, the Jews who actually believed that Jesus of Nazareth, that carpenter from Galilee, is the Messiah. And by the way, they were a minority of the Jews who thought that. But they being converted, they still thought of Christianity as their religion. They and they alone are still God's chosen people. But then you have Peter coming in one day, 10 years later, and he's actually baptized and converted a Roman centurion named Cornelius and his family. And then you have Paul, who's going all over the Roman Empire on not just 1, 2, but 3 separate missionary journeys. And he is converting all of these Romans and Greeks and the Corinthians, all these Gentiles, and these apostles are saying that these hated Gentiles are our brothers and sisters in Christ, and they're Christians too? No way, we ain't going to have that. We don't want that. We are better than them. We don't want them here. So are you saying that they have to be part of our religion? Well, all right. Well, if they do, then we're going to make it difficult for them. All of you Gentiles, male Gentiles who are just baptized, you think you're saved. You're not really saved, though. You're not going to be saved until you're physically circumcised, until you have to go through that very painful surgery. That's when you'll be saved. The book of Galatians and Acts chapter 15 deals all with that. And the Jews knew exactly what they were doing. Hey, you really have to be dedicated if not only are you willing to just simply be dunked in water, which is nothing, but to go through a very painful surgery that might have the very high chance of crippling you. No, not going to do that. That was their way of trying to get the Gentiles out of the church. So you had the serious problem of racism and bigotry and prejudice between Jew and Gentile in the early church. First 11 chapters of Romans deals with that. Romans chapter 4, one of the things that he is bringing out, he is saying, look, Jews, Jewish Christians, you need to realize that the Gentiles, you have sinned just as much as they did. Chapter 3, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. You need to also realize that you need the grace of God just as much as they do. You all need the grace of God. And now in chapter 4, what he's bringing out is, guess what? Abraham, your ancestor that started the Jewish nation, By him starting the Jewish nation, that means that originally, before he started it with his family, guess what, Jews? He wasn't a Jew. You circumcised Jews, and again, circumcision under the Old Testament was the sign that you were an Israelite, that you were a Jew, that you were God's chosen people. There was a time in Abraham's life, your ancestor Abraham, whom you revere as a holy man of God, a man of faith. There was a time in his life when he wasn't circumcised, just like these Gentiles that you despise, and yet God still considered him faithful. What do you think of that? That's the point of chapter 4. Let's start with verse 9. Actually, verses 7 and 8, he quotes David out of the Psalms here. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not count his sin. The Jewish Christians were thinking that is only for us. It is not for the Gentiles. It's only for us. And he nips that mindset in the bud with the very next verse. Look at verse 9. Is this blessing then only for the circumcised, the Jews? Or is it also for the uncircumcised, the Gentiles? We say that faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it counted to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. Go back up to verse 3. For what does it say? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Do any of your Bibles have a little cross-reference section that says exactly in verse 3, exactly where in the Old Testament that quote comes from? Any of your Bibles have that? Linda? All right, let's go over to Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. Go over to Genesis 15, and you look at verse 6, and also in 22? Well, let's focus on chapter 15. You look at chapter 15, verse 6, that it has that exact quote, right? That's chapter 15. I want you to go to chapter 17. Chapter 17 is after chapter 15, right? And chapter 17, therefore, chronologically, is after when God counted Abraham's faith as righteousness. And in chapter 17, if you just skim over the chapter there, we're not going to read it, but just skim over the chapter. What's God telling Abraham to do in chapter 17? He's telling him, I want you to be circumcised. This will be a sign between me and you and all your descendants, that you are my chosen people. Abraham, I want you and all of your family, your male servants, your son, I want you to be circumcised. Now, he's not even told to be circumcised until chapter 17. So what was he before chapter 17? Was he circumcised or uncircumcised before? He was not circumcised before chapter 17. But it was chapter 15, while he was uncircumcised. It was chapter 15 that it says Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. What's the point that Paul's making here? God counted Abraham's faith as what made him righteous in the sight of God years before God told Abraham, I want you to be circumcised. And so if God can count an uncircumcised man as righteous because of his faith, if he can do that with the man, your ancestor that you Jews hold up and revere so much, Abraham, if he can do that with Abraham, guess what? He can do that with these Gentiles that you despise too. That's the point that he's making in chapter 4. Does that make sense? Exactly. Look, there is 15 years between chapter 15 and chapter 17. That's very true. Good point. 15 years between the time that God said of Abraham, you are righteous because of your faith, and the time that he told Abraham to be circumcised. That's the point that he is making here. Let's keep reading Romans 4. of verse 11. Romans 4, verse 11. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well, and to make him the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. In other words, here's what Paul's telling the Jewish Christians who did not want the Gentiles to be a part of the church. Abraham was counted as righteousness. Abraham was counted as righteous in the eyes of God due to his faith 15 years before he was circumcised. So you don't need to be circumcised in order to be counted as righteous in the eyes of God. This happened to Abraham. He received that sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The reason God did this, verse 11, was so that Abraham would be the father of all who believe without being circumcised, the Gentiles. In other words, so that Abraham is the precedent. Abraham is the precedent of righteousness being given to someone through their faith, even though they're not circumcised. Abraham's the precedent for that. That's what the term father means in this particular context. But also, he's saying Abraham's not just the precedent. Abraham's faith is not just the precedent for these Gentiles. Jews, look at verse 12. You circumcised? Abraham's the precedent for you too. And here's how he's the precedent. God counted him as righteous not because he was circumcised, because he wasn't circumcised at the time. God counted him as righteous because of his faith that prompted him to obey God. And he does that with you too, Jews. You are, and that's the point of chapter 4 overall, that you are justified by faith and not by the works of the law of Moses, such as circumcision. Adrian, you had your hand raised?
Yeah, I was going to say that slippery slope, and I don't want to deter your thought process in this class. A lot of teachings surrounding faith only or the lack of necessity of baptism, spiritual circumcision comes from this concept. See, Abraham is kind of righteous just because of his faith. Therefore, us modern Christians and spiritual circumcision being baptism, we can be counted righteous with just our faith. What say you?
What say me?
What say John?
First thing I say is that's the only comment you have in this entire class. You're done. The second thing that I have to say is the rest of this chapter, it deals pretty much with that argument. And before we get into it, let me just ask you this. Faith. There was someone here, and I think it was Wednesday night's class when we were talking about Jephthah's daughter last Wednesday night. I asked what faith is, and someone said trust. Yes, you said trust. And very good answer. What is faith? It is trust. Trust in God. Would everyone say that that's what faith is? You trust God? All right, so you read in the Bible. You brought up baptism, right? You read in the Bible. Words of Jesus, the Son of God. John says he is God. You read in the Bible. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. You read that phrase. Do you trust the one who said it or not? Do you trust the one who said it or not? If you really do, then you'll do it. You'll do it. If you don't, well, why do you think that Jesus said at the second part of the verse? Well, he said the first part of the verse, Matthew or Mark 16, verse 16. He said, he who believes and is baptized shall be saved. Second part of the verse says, he who does not believe shall be condemned. Why didn't he say, he who does not believe and is not baptized shall be condemned? Why didn't he just say that? Yes.
Because if you don't believe in the first part, you're not going to follow the second.
Exactly. If you don't believe the first part of that sentence, which includes baptism, then the second part of the sentence applies to you. You don't trust God. You don't believe God. What we're going to see in Romans 4, and James brings out the same thing about Abraham. Abraham's faith, his trust in God, is the motivation. It is the primary motivation. You could even say it's the sole motivation of his obedience to what God told him to do. Take, Linda, you brought up that the verse 3, it says, Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteous. You said that it not only was mentioned in chapter 15, but also in chapter 22 of Genesis, right? Well, in chapter 22, what's that chapter about? The very first verse in Genesis 22 says that God tested. Some translations say tempt. That's not the best translation. It should be test. God tested Abraham. How did he test him? Hey, Abraham, I want you to take your son, your only son, the son I promised you, Isaac, and I want you to sacrifice him. Now, I want you to think about that. First of all, any father in this room, how difficult would that be for you to do for your child? We were talking about Jephthah's daughter on a Wednesday night. I'm very, very glad that a close study of the text in Judges shows that what he really did, what his promise really was concerning her, was dedicating her to God so that she would not marry off, rather than actually sacrificing her. I couldn't do that. I can't lift a finger towards my daughters, I can't do anything like that. Abraham, being a father, no. How in the world? How? It would just be, that's such a hard thing to do. But because it's a hard thing to do, it's a pretty good test of your faith, isn't it? It's a pretty good test of how much you really trust God. And remember what the book of Hebrews said about Abraham? What was Abraham thinking when he decided that he was going to go ahead and do it? Hebrews says that Abraham was saying, well, he's just going to raise Isaac from the dead. That's what he's going to do. And that's how much Abraham trusted God. Because think about it. This is Abraham's thought process. All right. He promised me Isaac. And it took him 25 years to fulfill that promise. He also promised me that it would be through Isaac that I would have descendants that would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Isaac hasn't even gotten married yet. Isaac doesn't have any kids yet. At this point in time, by the way, if you do a research on the timeline, Isaac's a teenager at this time. He's not even married yet. He doesn't have any kids yet. So, he wants me to kill him? How in the world is he going to fulfill his promise to give me millions of descendants through my son if my son is dead? Well, I trust him. I trust him with all my heart and soul. He will keep his promise to me. So there's only one alternative. There's only one solution, and that is I will do this, and then he will raise Isaac from the dead. I know he'll do it, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. That's trust. That's faith. When you as Christians know ahead of time that God has promised eternal peace and joy and to be with him in heaven as a result of faithful, penitent obedience to him. And you also know that he has promised that the wages of sin, unrepentant sin, is death, and death, the Bible brings out, is talking about an eternity on fire in hell. You know that those are the promises of God. Then whether or not you actually believe his promises, whether or not you trust him, that is the only determining factor as to whether or not you will obey him. And when you don't obey him, That is the only determining factor as to whether or not you will repent and start obeying him again. Your faith. And so, in answer to Adrian's question, the problem with the premise of faith alone, all you have to do is believe, and that's it, that whether or not you obey what God told you to do, whether it be baptism or anything else. The problem with the concept that I hear thrown around a lot, His grace will cover me. The problem with that with that statement in the context in which it's usually given, and the way it's usually used is, I can go ahead and do this thing that the Bible calls sin, and it'll be okay because His grace will cover me. His grace will cover you only if, number one, you don't do that sin. Number two, if you do commit that or any sin, you repent of it and stop doing it, and then start obeying Him again. That's when His grace will cover you. The problem with faith alone is it doesn't take into account what that faith motivates you to do, which is to obey God, which is exactly what it did with Abraham here. I really appreciate the question. You still get no more for the rest of the class, though. All right, let's keep reading. Verse 13. For the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be heir of the world did not come through the law, talking about the law of Moses, but through the righteousness of faith. And why did it not come through the law of Moses? Why did not that promise to Abraham not come through the law of Moses? The law of Moses was not going to be written until 400 years later. 400 years. How many years has the United States of America been in existence? 243. So double that, pretty much. And that's when the law of Moses would come into existence. 400 years after Abraham lived. So, and what's he saying here? Jews, you think that you will be justified by keeping the commandments of the law of Moses, such as circumcision, and that's one of the reasons why you are really pushing that the Gentiles do that too. Well, Abraham was justified by his faith, and the law of Moses was 400 years into the future when he was justified. Well, the law of Moses had absolutely nothing to do with his justification in the sight of God. And guess what? It has nothing to do with these Gentiles' justification. And really, Jews, it has nothing to do with your justification either. Romans chapter 7 is going to bring that out. All right, keep reading. For if it is the adherents of the law who are to be the heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, there is no transgression. If it is the adherents of the law who are to be the heirs, faith is null and the promise void. Here's why. As you brought out, Jose. Abraham's faith wasn't based on the law of Moses. The law of Moses didn't even exist when Abraham had faith. So if it is based on the law of Moses, then Abraham's faith is irrelevant. And the promise made to Abraham, that's also irrelevant. That's the point that he is making here. I like the second part of, all of verse 19. The law brings wrath. Here's what that means. In context, he's talking about the law of Moses. But really, you could also apply that same principle about the law bringing wrath. You could apply that to Christ's law. You can apply that to the law that God gave to the patriarchs before the law of Moses. The law brings wrath. Here's why that is. What is sin? Define sin for me, and I'll give you a hint. The definition is right there in the second part of that verse, verse 19. Define sin for me. Transgression of the law, which is why it says where there is no law, there is no transgression. If I am driving along and there is no posted speed limit, there is no code in that particular town's law books that in light of a posted speed limit, the automatic speed limit is this. If there is no law whatsoever about a speed limit where I'm driving, then is it possible, yes or no, for me to break the speed limit law, if there is no law. Exactly. Exactly. But if there is a law, whether the sign is posted or whether the books say it's automatically 35 miles per hour wherever it's not posted, if there is some sort of law, then is it possible for me to break that law? Yes. Now, for those who break the law of God, what's the definition of sin? Breaking the law of God, transgression of the law of God. Those who break the law of God are sinners. Go all the way back to Romans chapter 1, verse 18. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against whom? The ungodliness of men, right? A synonym for sinners, those who transgress the law. Where it says in verse 19, the law brings wrath. Why does it bring wrath? Because people break the law, and therefore, if they're not justified, if they're not forgiven, what's the ultimate result? The wrath of God, because they broke his law. And that's why, look at verse 16 of Romans 4, that's why he says, that is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring. Not only to the adherent of the law, talking about the law of Moses, but also to the one who shares the faith of Abraham, who is father of us all, as it is written, I have made you the father of many nations, in the presence of the God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. He's saying, Jews, if you are going to make justification, forgiveness, salvation, if you're going to make that based on keeping the law of Moses, no one's going to be saved. Gentiles aren't going to be saved, which I understand, Jews, is your goal anyway, because you don't like the Gentiles. But guess what, Jews? You're not going to be saved either, because every single one of you have broken the law of Moses. None of you have kept it perfectly except one, Jesus. None of you have kept it perfectly. So by your logic of you have to keep the law of Moses, you are basically condemning yourself. And this is why, go back up to verse 16, it's not perfect law keeping, whether it be the law of Moses or any law of God. Our salvation does not depend on perfect law keeping, that impossibility. Rather, our salvation depends on faith. He does not say faith alone. Going back to Adrian's comment earlier, Martin Luther, a leader of the Protestant Reformation, he wrote his own translation of the New Testament. He wrote his own translation of Romans. Martin Luther was a big proponent of the idea of faith alone. In fact, James chapter 2, verses 14 through 26 says over and over and over again, faith without works is dead. That one is justified by works and not by faith alone. Well, Martin Luther didn't like the book of James. Martin Luther called the book of James, quote, a right strawy epistle. Strawy being back then meaning loony. It's a loony epistle. I don't like it. It's crazy. He didn't like that. And here in Romans chapter 3, verse 16, where it says, this is why it depends on faith, in Martin Luther's translation of the Bible, he added a word that wasn't in the original Greek. In his translation, it says, this is why it depends on faith alone. The word alone is not in the original Greek, but Martin Luther added it because that's how committed he was to that notion. What does it depend on? It depends on faith. What kind of faith? The kind of faith that Abraham had. What kind of faith did Abraham have? It was so strong a trust in God that his trust in God motivated him to go along with what God told him to do, even when God told him to do what God told him to do was the hardest thing that any parent could ever do. That's how strong his faith was. And that's the kind of faith that we need to have as well. Abraham's faith, the promise, it depends on faith so that, look at verse 16, the promise may rest on grace. Why does it say rest on grace? Because, going back to Romans 3, all of us have sinned. All of us have fallen short of the glory of God. Before you became a Christian, you sinned, and that's why you needed to become a Christian. If you had never sinned, ever, would you need to have your sins washed away in baptism? What sins? You had never sinned, right? But you did sin. We all sinned. That's why we needed to become a Christian. That's why we need the grace of God. And guess what? Since your baptism, have you sinned? I want a show of hands. Who sinned since their baptism? I want those hands raised. Come on, all of you. You know it, right? All of us have sinned. So do you need the grace of God? You sure do. You sure do. Your faith, your trust in God is what motivates you to obey God. But sometimes your faith is not what it should be, right? Sometimes your faith is weak. Happens to me, happens to you. And that it happened to Abraham, by the way. It did. And that's why you need the grace of God, because God knows you will never be able to perfectly keep his laws. But he still wants to save you anyway. So what will he do? Hey, Jose, you messed up. You willing to try again? You want to make your faith stronger? Come on, let's do this again. Get back up on that bike. I'll help you. You going to get back up on the bike? You going to do it again? You going to work harder? Guess what? You do that, I've already forgotten that you failed. That's why our salvation depends on our faith, but also that the promise rests on grace, and that it's guaranteed to all of his offspring. Talking about Abraham's offspring. Again, the Jews were like, we are Abraham's children. We are Isaac's descendants. Yes, but Abraham had another son, didn't he? Ishmael. And now that I think about it, I'll have to double check, but I think that there's an implication there in the latter part of Genesis 22, or maybe in Genesis 23, that he had even more children after that, I believe. And the descendants of those children, they were not the Israelite nation because that came through Isaac, but Ishmael's descendants became the Arab nations. Abraham's descendants through his other children also became non-Israelite nations, Gentile nations. And that's his point here, where he says, where he quotes, where God said to Abraham, I've made you the father not of one nation, Israel, I've made you the father of many nations. And that's why he says that Abraham, verse 16, is the father of us all. Jews, you revere Abraham as your ancestor, the father of the Israelite nation, the father of the Jewish nation. Guess what? He's also the father of many of these other nations that you despise. And just as you need the grace of God, so do they. And by the way, if you want to get really technical, it even goes back further than that, further than Abraham. You want to know one of the main reasons why, if you read the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 9, Genesis chapter 10, it's also mentioned in Genesis chapter 11, you're reading about Noah and how when the flood was over, they leave the ark and the rainbow and everything, and then just suddenly out of nowhere, you get these long lists of genealogies. Do you want to know why those are in the Bible? Because God is letting us know this is the origin of all these different nations. Now, who was Noah's sons, 3 sons? Do you all remember their names? Anyone know this? Starts with an S, the first one. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. I'm just waiting for when I'm talking to Katie about Shem, Ham, and Japheth. I just know she's going to ask for potatoes to go with the ham. I know she will. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, if you are someone who is prejudiced against Jews, you're someone who is bigoted against Jews, you are called an anti-Semite. Where do the term Semite come from? Semite comes from Shem, because if you read the Genesis genealogy, where it lists Shem's descendants, it goes down, starting with Shem, Noah's son. It goes down generation after generation, and you'll see that Abraham is right there. Abraham is a descendant of Shem, who is a descendant of Noah. And Noah and Shem, Ham and Japheth, and their wives were the only ones who survived that worldwide flood, right? But Ham and Japheth also had descendants, didn't they? And those descendants ended up becoming all of these other nations that the Jews in Paul's day despised so much. And so when he is saying that Abraham is the father of us all, you could take that even further. Because not only did Abraham father other nations beside Israel, but Abraham's ancestors fathered pretty much the rest of the planet outside of Israel. Which is just, when you really stop to think about it, in Paul's day as well as in our day, it really goes to show you just how truly foolish the whole concept of racism is. When you really think about it. I don't like so-and-so because of the color of their skin or their ethnicity or the country that they're from. We all come from the same place. All of us. What he is saying to the Jews about the Gentiles here applies to us. We are here today because Noah and his family survived the flood. That's why we are all here. We are all related in a sense. If you want to go all the way back to Noah and go even further than that, go all the way back to Adam and Eve. We all come from the same source. Did you know, by the way, I did this real quick. I did this study one time on skin color. What is it genetically that makes some people white, some people black, some people brown, some people yellow? And it's melatonin, right? But genetically, as far as ancestry, you trace that back. What determines that? Well, long story short, I read a lot of articles by a lot of biologists that cover this, and guess what they determine has to be an almost certain certainty in order for there to be the different colors of human beings that exist today. Adam and Eve, one of them had to have been white, the other one had to have been black. That's the only way to biologically explain the different colors of everyone today. The very first human beings, Adam and Eve, it's almost a 100% biological certainty, according to the research. One of them had to be white, the other one had to be black. Think about that for just a second. That also shows the foolishness of racism and bigotry. We are all the same. We all come from the same place. We were all created by God. And what he is bringing out here in Romans 4, Jews, you who despise the Gentiles, guess what? You both came from God. You both came from the same ancestor, Abraham. There is no difference between you. You both have sinned. You both need the grace of God. You are the same. That's the main point that he is making in chapter 4. Any closing comments before we continue? Yes, ma'am. And that also, just that concept, that just shows how the foolishness of man, what the foolishness of man will prompt people to do, the extent that it will go to. In the Bible, all you read of is one. And that's just it. Any other thoughts and comments? Next week, what we're going to do is finish out chapter 4 and go into chapter 5. So be reading the rest of chapter 4, and we're going to start chapter 5 next week too, Lord willing. Thank you all for your attention. If there is anyone here who has just come in and you missed the worship service and you would like to partake of communion, please see Hugh Don once class is over and you'll be served communion. Thank you all.